Drummers don't just have one instrument. We have an orchestra at our disposal. We play with our hands. We have instruments we play with our feet.
Tum, 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 bass drum, bugga, boom, boom.
Yes.
Our primary job, of course, is to keep time, but there is so much more that we can do with this wonderful collection of instruments to make music.
I think when I came to it, I saw it as, right, these are all the separate instruments. But I think the longer I've been playing the drums, you think of it all as one instrument, and it's just one idea that you're expressing throughout the whole kit.
I play orchestrationally, creating space and creating movement, rather like decorating a chandelier.
The phrasing and the music are the most important thing.
If you could come up with a drum hook, as important, I think, as the melodic hook.
It's about trying to play the instrument with other people.
I'm Stephen Owusu Asamoah. I'm the president of the culture troupe. I've been playing for about 25 years.
My name is Bequin Samson. I've been driving for almost 20 good years now.
My name is Benjamin and he is
Ebenezer Opokwajimai.
We have been playing for 12 years.
My name is Mike Bochi and I have been playing this drum for 12 years.
My name is Asiedu Dansu Evans and I played this drum for 2 years.
My name is Bernard Dubois and I've been playing for 1 year.
1 year.
Ghana here, we have different kind of dances, so watch us as we are about to perform. Dance is also called valuable efficient dance. You're going to see 3 guys holding a paddle, meaning we are on a sea, a canoe, going to hunt for a fish. The ladies also coming to buy the fish, the basket.
Slaves were forbidden by law to play drums in Jamaica, Barbados, and St. Kitts, as well as several of the colonies that would eventually become the United States. In South Carolina, for instance, slaves reportedly used drums in the Stono Rebellion of 1739. Rebel slaves, calling out liberty, marched on with colors displayed and 2 drums beating, pursuing all the white people they met with and killing man, woman, and child. They increased every minute by new Negroes coming to them, so that they were above 60, some say 100, on which they halted in a field and set to dancing, singing, and beating drums to draw more Negroes to them. Following the rebellion, the Slave Act of 1740 was passed in South Carolina to prohibit the use of wooden swords and other mischievous or dangerous weapons, or using or keeping of drums, horns, or other loud instruments, which may call together or give sign or notice to one another of their wicked designs or purposes. The fact that drums are listed alongside dangerous weapons is telling. Similar rules were established in other regions. In St. John's Parish, Louisiana, for example, slaves were prohibited in 1849 from beating the drum or dancing after sundown.
The inhumane treatment says a lot, that indeed they're resisting their enslavement, that like any other human being whose rights and opportunities are being taken away, that they're going to resist and fight back.
Burning down barns was something that occurred regularly and increased during harvest time when the workload was heaviest. Poisoning could not be caught readily, and it was often something that was feared by whites even when it didn't exist.
One symptom of their fear was that there was a law that white men had to carry guns when they went to church. Sunday was the only day off for enslaved people. And so the white folks feared that the uprising, if it ever came, would happen on Sunday when all the whites were gathered in church. Therefore, the white men were required to carry their guns to church.
It was on a Saturday night, September 1739. It was a work crew. Many of them are Angolans, including a man named Jemmy, who becomes the leader.
The fated Sunday finally came on the Stono River, southwest of Charleston. And they got to a store and broke in, and they killed a Mr. Hutchinson, decapitated him and put his head on a pole and cleared out his store of guns.
It happens in harvest time, which is the time when blacks are being worked the hardest. It also happens in malaria time, and there is an epidemic going on in Charleston, which has virtually shut down the town.
They must have realized that they couldn't possibly take over the area and drive out the Europeans. But they did recognize the possibility that if they took common action as soldiers, they might be able to escape.
The governor of Florida had already issued a decree that any African who was a slave who made it to Florida would be free, and there was indeed a colony there of ex-slaves.
There is this African manned fortification, and when the Stono Rebellion breaks out, it becomes clear that what these people are trying to do is to reach Fort Mose.
People begin to join them. They burn successive plantations, kill some of the white people living there. draw some of the blacks with them. Others are afraid to join in and refuse to go. But unfortunately for them, they meet the lieutenant governor riding north.
They gave chase to him, but he was able to sound the alarm, and then, of course, a sort of a posse is formed, and they set out after this group of Africans.
It's an amazing moment. If they had been able to take him hostage, who knows what the dynamics would have been. These people are pursued south for a day or two. If they had been able to go another 24 or 48 hours so that more people could have joined them, their strength would have been greater, and who knows what the prospects would have been.
And the whites came on them. They surrounded these men and they fired on them. A lot of them were scattered. Many of them were killed.
Some of them escaped into the swamp, but those that they did capture, they chopped their heads off and put their heads on poles leading out down what is today US 17 out of the Charleston to send a message to the other Africans. This is what will happen to you if you rebel.
After the Stono Rebellion, all of the separate laws governing slavery were consolidated into a single code. This black code restricted the movement of black people and regulated almost every aspect of the lives of the enslaved.
The crushing of the Stono Rebellion was a tragedy. To me, these people were freedom fighters. Someone like Jimmy, newly arrived from Angola, is able to show others around him that this is not the only way to live. This can change. It may not change this time, but it will change in the future.
Indicative of the fact that these body pattern traditions were conceptualized as instrumental music is the significance of both rhythm and pitch in their execution. Bessie Jones's Step It Down treatise establishes this point quite clearly. If you slap your thigh and then the back of your hand, you will notice that the second slap is higher in pitch than the first. Slap other parts of your body, chest, side, cheek, the top of your head, and you will discover a whole range of pitches can be sounded on your own anatomy. Both patent juba and hambone mark the ability of African American slaves to subvert the intended impact of the prohibition on drums in colonial America beginning in the 1740s. While the instrument itself was banned, it was not possible to ban or even completely squelch the spirit that fueled its existence. The drum continued to live in African American memory and imagination, and it continues to fuel and sustain African American music making in the 21st century.
Dr. John Wyeth, a slave owner in Huntsville, Alabama in the late 19th century, described how juba was performed. Here were accompanists who patted with the hands, keeping accurate time with the music. In patting, the position was usually a half stoop or forward bend, with a slap of one hand on the left knee followed by the right, and then a loud slap of the two palms together. I should add that the left hand made 2 strokes in half time to 1 for the right, something after the double stroke of the left drumstick in beating the kettle drum. This array of detailed descriptions of juba demonstrates a type of multiple percussion. That is, the accounts show clearly that a variety of sounds and therefore rhythms were possible from the use of the hands and feet and the various parts of the body.
The body as instrument. African Americans have been prolific in creating forms of music and dance by either transforming the body into a percussion instrument, performing percussively on melodic instruments, or performing melodically on percussion instruments. They have not only subverted efforts of Europeans and Euro-Americans to impose foreign cultural and musical values, they have asserted their identity as people of African descent who possess self-defined values and behave in ways that are culturally proscribed. At times, with no resources other than the human body and African-derived concepts of music making, New World Africans hit a straight lick with a crooked stick, creating such traditions as patent juba, the juba dance, and hambone during the period of slavery. Patting, patent, juba rhythmic body percussion used by slaves to accompany singing or dancing.
We need to go back really to look at all of Africanist dances that were made in the circle and that were really made as a community speaking.
Percussion, a musical sound made by striking an instrument, dates back to the beginning of our history, and drumming was one of its earliest forms. Ancient African drumming was traditionally practiced in a circle, in the form of a line with no beginning or end, inspiring democratic participation with calls and responses. The drum circle was sacred. The circle formed a ritual, a blessing, a type of shared worship. It was intrinsically social, unifying. It built a community. It marked important events in their lives: births, weddings, harvests, funerals. Typically, these drum circles were accompanied by singing, clapping, and dancing, and oftentimes dancers would move in and out of the circle, demonstrating their dance skills. And when Africans were captured and transported to America as slaves, the drum circle naturally came along with them. Then in 1739, in the British colony of South Carolina, a group of African slaves planned an organized revolt. Though the rebellion was suppressed, it led to the passing of the Negro Act of 1740, a harsh slave code which included a clause prohibiting the using or keeping of drums. And it wasn't long before anti-drumming laws spread throughout the South.
Whites at the time realized that the insurrection had been planned through the use of rhythm and the drums.
Take away the drums, that doesn't mean you take away the rhythms. Rhythms can be produced other ways. They can be produced with feet and the floor. They can be produced with clapping and slapping the body. It's called juba.
Stripped of its drums, the circle evolved to incorporate these substitutions, using the body and voice as the musical elements.
And so you have these percussive substitutes for the drum, right? You have the patting of the feet. You have juba, the patting of the body.
This array of detailed descriptions of juba demonstrates a type of multiple percussion. That is, the accounts show clearly that a variety of sounds and therefore rhythms were possible from the use of the hands and feet in the various parts of the body. It is an interesting point that the drum set or traps, an American invention originated by Black Americans in the early 20th century, involves the use of all four limbs of the body in performance. It is as if the concepts of various sizes and types of percussion were already there in juba and were just waiting for the time to be put back onto real drums, in the form of traps. There is no such grouping of drums in Africa. Contrary to Mr. Lanier's account from above, much of the purpose of this body percussion was to express as much tone and musical color variety as possible.
Sidebar: four-way independence, four-way coordination. All of your limbs are playing different rhythms. It's multiple rhythms happening on multiple kit pieces at the same time. We've built a solid base through the rhythm, through rudiments.
Is it true that you can play a different rhythm with each limb?
Yes, which does it, you know. If you check, you will see that my four limbs are playing different things.
Okay.
You know.
To the uninitiated, Tony's drumming looks effortless. Fela Kuti had to hire 4 drummers to replace him when he left his band. Fela also said that without Tony, there would be no Afrobeat.
Afrobeat that made the world listening to African music.
To Jack Bruce's counterpoint, he gives rhythm. And to Eric Clapton's technical virtuosity, he gives shape. On their first tour together, he practiced so intensively that he left behind him a trail of hotel bills for broken furniture. We asked him if he still practiced as much.
No, it's not. I don't practice at all.
Not at all?
I used to, but I don't anymore. I mean, I just used to play solos. I used to just sit on the drum kit and play it all day.
Can you show us some?
You want me to play them?
Please.
At this time of day.
Independence, the ability to play a different thing with all four limbs. We which is how I play things that sound incredibly fast when I'm not actually moving anything very fast, because all 4 beats are landing in a different place, so what comes out is 4 times as fast. But it's not how fast you play, it's what you say.
Ginger Baker's most notable achievement that should be recognized is the first rock drum solo. And me as a 15-year-old kid at the time was like, yeah, that's the rock drummer I want to be.
I must have been 16. I was exactly the sweet spot when my brain clicked on and said, what's it all about? It was Ginger's drums.
I'm here today because of Ginger, because he was the absolute inspiration for me being in a band, playing the drums. I absolutely thought, now that's what I'd like to be.
It became Ginger's thing. He'd do these very long drum solos. You either liked them or you didn't like them. I liked them because I could go off and have a smoke, you know.
Cream, how popular were they?
Oh, huge, huge.
How huge is huge? Well, they did 3 nights in Madison Square Garden. They could have done 2 weeks and sold out every night.
When a promoter hired the Cream, Ginger wanted a kick.
No other instrument requires the use of all 4 limbs in the same way as the drums. Being a drummer is physically and mentally demanding, especially for styles of music that use 2 bass drums.
Jazz drumming perspective. It is often said that jazz is America's original art contribution to the world. At the heart of jazz is the jazz drummer, applying their skills on a collection of percussion instruments: snare drum, bass drum, tom-toms, miscellaneous small percussion, and cymbals. These instruments, when played by a single player, are collectively referred to as the trap set, or in more modern terms, the drum set. The term trap set is a contraction of the term set of contraptions. While a part of jazz drumming is functional, in that a player provides rhythmic support for an ensemble, the jazz drummer must also be a complete musician, aware of melody and composition. It is the latter that is the highest form of jazz drumming, in that the drummer must imply melody and form in the same way all musicians participating in a jazz ensemble are required to do.
Jazz drumming isn't just one of the various styles of U.S. drumming, it's the foundationary style that all the other styles came from. The underlying similarity in all the styles is the swing pulse. I call the swing pulse the rhythmic common denominator of all U.S. music. With that understanding and enough technical skills to play what the music needs, it's then a matter of playing with musicians who understand the music. They can help you develop your musicianship if you listen and keep an open mind. I'm going to break down and explain some of the basics of drum set technique and show you exercises that I've used that have helped me develop a strong swing pulse. I'm also including explanations of some of the more exotic rhythmic concepts I use, as I get asked about them a lot. It's my hope that you can gain some useful ideas from this program and that you continue, develop, and add to the drum set tradition.
The drum outfit travels the world. While American jazz was undoubtedly the most globally influential musical culture of the early 20th century, it was one of several distinct music genres born as a result of transcontinental migration. Chief among these were the sounds that emerged out of the transatlantic slave trade, which included not only the USA but also countries such as Brazil and Cuba. In Brazil, for instance, different manifestations of rhythm sections began to appear in musical ensembles, with complex improvised styles such as samba and choro featuring prominent use of percussion instruments like the surdo, tambourine, cuicas, and pandero. Similarly, Cuban son, a late 19th century dance music that became popular after spreading to Havana in the 1910s, relied on a percussive foundation provided by instruments including the bongo, clave, and maracas.
An instrument. After the Civil War, you know, people went on the battlefields and there were these drums. They're picking up cornets, they're picking up, you know, the marching instruments. And black Americans who wanted to play drums figured out how to take the big marching band and make it a bass drum that sat on the floor that you play with your foot. They took the crash cymbals that you would march with and called it a sock cymbal and worked out a mechanism so you could play with your left foot or right foot, depending on what hand you play. And then the snare drum, right? Well, that sits right in between your legs, and then you have all these other toms and cymbals. So if you look at the drum set, the bass drum and the snare drum, and I would argue at least one cymbal represents Western European military march music. Because with just those three instruments, with your bass drum, your hi-hat, and the snare drum, you can sound like a marching band. Easy. That's what it is. But you're one person. In a marching band, that takes three people, right? The tom-toms represent African drums because they're tuned to tones, just like African drums are. And you can get different inflections based on where you hit it. At the edge could be a slap, in the middle would be, you know, a long tone, whatever the case may be. And then your cymbals could be like a cowrie shell or some other rattle metallic sound that you hear on African drums, which Ollie Wilson called heterogeneous sound. It's the sound that sounds even though it's not the original sound. So if you hit the drum without the shaking, you hear the drum. That's the original sound. And once you add the cowrie shells and the metal plates and ringlets and all that kind of stuff, you get this additional texture, you know, and the cymbals can give you that. And then if you look at drumming...
However, while rhythm-based music in countries south of the USA tended to involve multiple disparate percussion instruments, each played by a separate musician, the concept of combining drums and percussion into a single hybrid drum outfit seems to have migrated primarily from the USA outwards through touring vaudeville, ragtime, and jazz bands.
You know, and the cymbals can give you that. And then if you look at drumming all over the world, from European orchestras to African drum choirs, there's always more than one. You got a person playing the timpani, a person playing the snare drum, a person playing the bass drum, a person playing the cymbals, a person playing, you know, the djembe, the doon. I mean, they're all playing even Afro-Caribbean music. I mean, they're playing each, even if they have two or three congas, is one or two of them playing. So it's a drum choir or a group. The drum set, you have all of that incorporated into one instrument played by one person that, in my perspective, has to channel the whole history of those people. And so the instrument creates a unique set of possibilities that prior to the Civil War had not been explored.
MD, and you make an interesting point in the DVD about the polyrhythmic style of padding juba, leading to the development of the drum set. SS, that's another percussion instrument, so to speak, that was developed in the US, where the person is playing with feet and hands, incorporating all the limbs just like the drum set. It's an African polyrhythmic concept, and it was eventually applied to the drum set, which is the only percussion instrument in the world that uses all four limbs. So in effect, the slaves being deprived of hand drums set the stage for the African American community to embrace the drum set. Without hand drums, they were forced to adapt to the European percussion instruments that were available in the 1800s, the snare drum and the bass drum, so they were comfortable with the individual instruments that would make up the drum set. I find it real interesting that basically the invention of the drum set is the invention of the bass drum pedal. After that happened in the late 1800s, basically the drum set wasn't used for any other purpose than playing jazz, which was a creation of the African American community. So when people first played the drum set, they wanted to play with that concept. One person playing a snare drum and a bass drum with that African American swing rhythmic concept. The drum set could have just as easily been used in a symphony orchestra, but it wasn't. It had some applications in, say, vaudeville and maybe a few situations here and there other than jazz, but they never took off as playing concepts. The playing concept that we now take for granted is essentially an African-American concept of how to use the instrument. This concept has been so thoroughly assimilated into the culture that most people don't even think about it or question how it came to be. Today, the drum set is an instrument that's been accepted all over the world, but it is quintessentially a U.S. instrument that developed from our unique history and culture.
Comes with it. Part 2 is called History of the U.S. Beat, and that is it's a history of the drum set and how the drum set developed as an instrument within U.S. music, because the drum set is really a U.S. innovation, and the way that people play the drum set has its roots in the USA. And so I go back to the early 1900s and demonstrate, you know, the different playing styles that developed from early New Orleans drumming through, you know, first ragtime New Orleans drumming to big band swing to bebop, early rock and roll, gospel, rhythm and blues, just all the fundamental playing styles that exist. And I just trace the history and, you know, the development of how that came about, which hopefully helps people play, you know, whatever music they're playing with more insight and depth.
Question: what were some of the surprises that you had in researching the early years, even the African connection? Were there any revelations about how this music developed as you found out about it in your research? Steve Smith: I think what was significant to me is that in the United States there's no hand drum tradition, which in fact led to the drum set becoming the rhythmic voice of the African American community. Whereas, if history had played itself out differently and let's say we had a hand drum tradition in the United States, the drum set may have never been a necessary invention because we would have had a whole percussive orchestra just with hand drumming. But because of the no drumming laws that were enforced during the time of slavery, the hand drum tradition that develops directly out of African drumming was squelched in this country. It is true that slaves in New Orleans were allowed to play hand drums once a week at Congo Square. But when you look at that in the scope of how long slavery existed in the United States, which is from the 1500s until the mid-1800s, Congo Square only represents about 40 years in the scheme of things. It began in 1817 and lasted until the mid-1850s. I think in some ways the significance of Congo Square has been a bit overemphasized. Congo Square had the drumming legally, but there were other places in Louisiana and all over the South that had the African polyrhythmic percussive concepts still being practiced illegally or underground for the entire history of slavery in the U.S. There's a great book by Dina Epstein called Sinful Tunes and Spirituals, which is a documentation of everything she could find on the African polyrhythmic concepts surviving in the United States throughout the years of slavery. She found that people kept the African pulse alive in many ways, such as playing washboards, jawbones, beating sticks on the floor, or stomping their feet on the floor. Even some African hand drums or African-style drums that were made in secret here in the U.S. have been found.
New Orleans in the early 1800s was a bustling cosmopolitan port city, a city which also provided a pivotal exception to the anti-drumming laws. Again, religion plays a significant role in our story. At the time, New Orleans was primarily French and Spanish, and, more importantly, Catholic. While the Protestant colonies suppressed African music, New Orleans observed the Catholic Day of Rest. On Sundays, slaves were given the day off, and with it, the freedom to meet and make music. These gatherings were restricted to an area in the back of town called Congo Square. It was here that the Black community and other interested parties gathered to dance and sing. Benjamin Latrobe, the noted architect, marvels at the spectacle.
An elderly Black man jabs repeatedly at a drum. A second drummer joins in, playing with the same staccato attack. a dance of seeming contradictions, a moving hieroglyph, informal and spontaneous, yet ritualized and precise. It is a dance of massive proportions. A dense crowd of dark bodies forms into circular groups, perhaps 500 or 600 individuals.
Congo Square became a huge tourist attraction.
And America being this
Asante and other Akan people sold as slaves to the New World brought their musical traditions with them. The oldest collected object from African American history, an Akan drum collected around 1730 in Virginia, is on display at the British Museum in London. Made from wood found only in Africa but using a deerskin drumhead from America, it resembles the royal Atumpan drums of the Asante. Slaves fighting for their freedom used talking drums to communicate during the Stono Slave Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina. Afterward, all African drums were banned in the North American colonies as dangerous weapons. Drums are not just for dancing. Messages and announcements are communicated in the beats played by expert drum masters. Pinkster celebrations. Pinkster Day, the name given to Pentecost Sunday, or Whit Sunday, in the Anglican Church, originally was a principal holiday of the Dutch in the Netherlands settlements. Later it was adopted by the English in New York, in parts of Pennsylvania, and in Maryland. It seems that the earliest reference to the popular name of the holiday occurred in a sermon book of 1667 by Adrian Fisher. Story of the descent of the Holy Ghost on the Apostles on Pinksterdag. After the first day or so of Pinkster, the celebration was often prolonged for as much as the full week after Pentecost. Black men and women took over completely with their Congo dances, dancing as they had in Africa. The festivals attracted large crowds of white spectators from both city and rural sections. Local historians wrote about Pinkster, the Carnival of the Africans, and novelists incorporated scenes from the Great Saturnalia of the New York Blacks in their fictional works, in the same way as writers described the exotic dancing of the black celebrants in the place Congo of New Orleans at the beginning of the 19th century.
Hi, I'm Chief Baba Neil Clark. I'm playing the African drum, and I think it's significant for Pinkster because in North America, the African drum was actually outlawed. It's one of the few instruments that Africans played that was outlawed. So the fact that the African drum was played for Pinkster, which took place for almost 200 years, it makes it very significant. Historically, when people talk about the African drum in North America, they talk about Congo Square, but there are evidences that the African drum was played throughout the eastern United States. The significance of Pinkster is that it was played publicly and people were actually allowed to play the drum. When people were brought from Africa in a condition of enslavement, they did not have the opportunity to bring their instruments with them. So they had to go about recreating their instruments when they arrived here. Traditionally, African drums were made from many different things, from carved tree trunks, from carved limbs of trees, from ceramic pots, from different materials depending on the environment that they were in. The Africans that were here during the period of enslavement of the Dutch colonies were primarily from West Africa and West Central Africa, countries of the Congo and Angola. So a lot of the drumming reflected the cultures of Congo and Angola. When the people arrived here, they did not have the opportunity to bring the drums with them, but they did bring the knowledge of how to make drums. So they would take different materials, different receptacles, and they would adapt them to make musical instruments. They used many different things. They took a hollow shell and they put animal skins, but they also used garden tools. So they would take tools that they made in the garden and tools that they use in the kitchen. So they had many different kinds of percussion instruments that they would use, but the drum in particular is probably the most sophisticated of the African musical instruments that people were playing. And they play it by using their hands or using sticks, and there are different notes that you get from the drum. So you have 5 basic notes. You have a bass, you have a tone, you have a slap, you have a muff, and you have a choke. And together these make the scale that is played on the African drum. The rhythms would be in the moment. Now, depending on where the individuals came from, they would play rhythms that were reflective of the region. So we don't have any recordings of that time, so we don't really know. And music is a very amorphous and evolving activity. So just like we know we have music from different eras here, you have music that is no longer played at that time. But so the music is language. It has everything to do with the language that people speak, and it has everything to do with the dances that people do, and that would be the inspiration for what was being played. But, you know, we could have a rhythm that sounds like, or we could have a rhythm that sounds like, or we could have a rhythm that sounds like, the variety of rhythms are endless. Pinkster took on many different forms because, again, we have to remember that people who were enslaved were required to work all of the time for free. So Pinkster was an opportunity when their owners would go to church on Sunday. The following Monday is when the Pinkster festivals would begin. And depending on where it was located in the Hudson River Valley, sometimes it would be for a day, sometimes it would be for a couple of days. Pinkster is documented to, in some places, have taken place for a week at a time. As a matter of fact, we know that in Albany, what we know as Capitol Hill in Albany was actually Pinkster Hill. And it was like a big fairground where they would clear the land and they would set up booths, and they would have a dancing ground, and people would have the opportunity to sell surplus goods from their garden and the gardens that they grew, and items that they manufactured, like bags and things that they might have made that they would trade and sell during the Pinkster Festival. People had the opportunity to travel and meet family members who might have been at a distant farm. So during that period of time, Pinkster, a lot of the restrictions were relaxed and people had an opportunity to travel and engage in what we know as festival, in a festival activities, cooking, singing, dancing, playing music. And again, depending on where it was, would depend on the extent and the depth that the festival would look like and sound like. The Pinkster Festival was an opportunity for people who were enslaved at that time to have the freedom to go around, to move around, to play their music. During the Pinkster Festival, they were given time off from working in the fields, and they would take their instruments that they had and they would move around from farm to farm, from plantation to plantation, and they would have the opportunity to create music in the moment. So when we think about what we call music known as jazz, and people attribute that to New Orleans and what happened in Congo Square, where African people were playing their musical instruments, in Pinkster, for 200 years, you had people who were musicians who would get together and they would play and they would create music in the moment, very much like what we know today as jazz music. So it was not rehearsed. There were no rehearsals. There were no particular songs that they were playing. They would create artistically, musically, music in the moment for people to sing, for people to dance, and it was spontaneous. And this took place in the Hudson River Valley for close to 200 years.
By the mid-18th century, another calendrical celebration associated with time off work at Christmas that some scholars believe was an adaptation of West and West Central African yam festivals was taking place. What became known variously in the New World plantation colonies as John Canoe, John Cornu, or John Canoe. John Cuners, by Bennett L. Steelman, 2006. John Cuners, also known as John Cooners, John Canoes, John Canoes, or John Canoe, were troops of slaves and free blacks, brightly dressed and often masked, who sang and danced on Christmas and New Year's Day in the Wilmington, Lower Cape Fear, and Albemarle Sound areas throughout much of the 1800s. The custom closely paralleled the annual John Canoe celebrations that survive today in Jamaica and the Bahamas. In the United States, however, the practice of coonering, or coonering, was apparently unique to North Carolina, except for isolated observances in Suffolk, VA, suppressed after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, and in Key West, Florida. All these practices seem to share roots in the West African Gold Coast, although details of their origin and spread are unknown. In the 1930s, Amer Africans told government interviewers from the Works Progress Administration about doing their rituals with hand drums. How did they do it if drums were outlawed? Simple. Take your everyday mortar or water barrel, put a rim and a skin on it, and there's your drum anytime you need it. And, for safety's sake, it was instantly dismantleable. Others buried their drums in the earth after use. Drums and Shadows. Set against the background of the antebellum slave trade, Drums and Shadows traces the persistence of African heritage in the culture of blacks living on the Georgia coast in the 1930s. In the later years of the Depression, members of the Georgia Writers Project visited and interviewed blacks, many of whose grandparents, smuggled into slavery as late as 1858, had passed on the customs and beliefs of their African past. Seeking evidence of African traditions, the project's workers questioned the blacks about conjure the curses and potions responsible for turns of luck, illnesses, and even death, about dreams that often determine the course of daily life, and about spirits and other apparitions as real as walking, breathing people. This study of African survivals was conducted by the Savannah unit of the Georgia Writers Project, under the direction of Mary Granger, the district supervisor. Muriel and Malcolm Bell, Jr. lived in Savannah for many years. Charles Joyner, the author of Down by the Riverside, a South Carolina slave community and editor of several collections of Sea Island black folk tales and songs, is Burroughs Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Southern History at Coastal Carolina University. MD. Any revelations from that project? Steve Smith. I found it somewhat of a revelation that there was no such thing as country drummers, blues drummers, gospel drummers, or rock drummers in the very first generation of adding drums to those styles of music. It turns out that most of the guys who played on the early country, blues, gospel, and early rock and roll sessions considered themselves jazz drummers. For example, in 1935, when Bob Wills wanted to add a drummer to his western swing group, the Texas Playboys, he got Smokey Dacus, who was a jazz drummer, because there was no such thing as a country drummer at the time. Drums weren't added to Nashville country music until the 50s. And the guy who did most of those early country sessions, Buddy Harman, was a jazz drummer as well. There were no real country drummers at that time. If a country musician wanted a drummer on his record at that time, he hired a jazz drummer. So the real revelation is that for about the first 50 years of U.S. music history, the only kind of drumming going on was jazz drumming, whether it was New Orleans style, swing style, bebop, or early rhythm and blues drumming, which is really more of a big band concept applied to a small group with a singer or sax player up front.
Going to make, even if you don't end up being a jazz drummer, it'll change the way you play the drums entirely.
Absolutely.
So take it away. Where do we start if you're brand new to playing jazz? And yeah.
Sure. Well, I want to just echo what you just stated about learning how to play jazz. To me is integral to learning how to play the drums. Not to go off on a deep diatribe, but if you look at early drum history, especially like early 1900s, late 1800s, drumming started with jazz, right? If you want to go back to folks like Baby Dodds, Warren Baby Dodds, and a lot of the innovators of this music, it began with that. So it's not just so much learning jazz helps you to kind of understand drums. Learning jazz is the foundation of drumming. So I think it's really key. So with that said, I'm going to kind of start with the ride cymbal.
You get a very high-pitched sound, like that. If you release the strings, you get a low pitch. So between the low and the high, you can get so many different tones, like that. Okay? And that is why you can actually talk with this instrument. Back in the days, we didn't have all the cell phones and pages and all that. We use the drums to communicate. So I want to play a little bit of that for you. But in order for you to know that you can really talk, I'm going to call my own name. My name is Kwame Ansambru. I'm going to say Kwame. Kwame. All right. So if I want to really play a song, I don't want to play a song in my native language. You may not understand. How about this song?
In his praise, crediting Dodds as his primary influence, Gene Krupa went further. Baby taught me more than all the others, not only drum playing but drum philosophy. He did all that the others did, and more. He was the first great drum soloist. His concept went on from keeping time to make the drums a melodic part of jazz. It was partly the way he tuned his drums, the intervals he used. I got that from him. And it was partly his concept of tone. Baby could play a tune on his drums, and if you listened carefully, you could tell the melody.
Hello everyone, my name is Alvin Atkinson and welcome to the Jazz Academy. Today we're going to talk about the drums as a melodic rhythm instrument. That's right, every note can be found on the piano. Can you recognize this melody? Right? Happy birthday! So, with the drums, let's talk about developing a solo, thinking about the drums as a melody instrument. Let's use a song like Caravan. So Caravan, the melody is basically ba ba dee doo 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 dee doo da boo dee doo dee doo dee doo da be dee 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 doo da be doo be ya be boo be doo be ya. So this is a challenge for you drummers, finding the melody on the drums. So you have the basic pitch here. It gets higher as you begin to mash in the middle, as you go to the side. So let's start off with Caravan. Let's try ba ba dee doo 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 dee doo da. Right? Boo-dee doo-dee doo-dee doo-da. All right? So now, let's start off and play Caravan. Here we go. Second A. So that's the first two A's of Caravan. So when you think about the drums,
Coordination is a nice thing to have going, but taken to extremes, you set up rhythmic interference instead of maintaining a groove. It becomes a case of having things running so counter to each other that the whole thing stops swinging. And when we speak of melodic drumming, we aren't actually playing melody, per se. We're making people hear melodies by dealing with approximations of pitch, and by the combination of rhythms that go with certain melodies. When you're thinking melody, it becomes obvious because the phrases wind up being more fluid.
or on the piano. But there's one place you don't often hear it, the drums.
Your primary job as a drummer is to keep time.
Drummers have kept time for centuries. We can hear it in the military corps. And drummers continue to keep time in songs we hear on the radio.
See how I'll leave with every piece of you.
But the drums are capable of so much more than this. They can sing.
If you go back to African culture where drumming came from, there were talking drums. You know, where they could bend the pitches, and they were communicating with other groups, you know, of the vicinity where they could hear each other, and communicating within the group they were playing in. I play this instrument, and I play jazz specifically because I love to converse and have a dialogue with other musicians. I have to be able to play melodically to be able to interact on the level that I want to interact with the other musicians in my band.
Let's try a little experiment. First, check out the melody in this classic Duke Ellington piece.
Don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing.
You got it? Now let's see if Allison Miller can play it on the drums.
Don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing.
Allison's playing different drums to produce a range of pitches. The bigger the drum, the lower the note.
Okay, so that's a fairly literal interpretation of a melody. Let me try it now doing one drum rim shots. Cool, you can hear the melody in there, right? And you can even do something like this.
Those are rim shots on multiple drums. When you bend the pitch, a single drum can produce a huge range of notes.
You can think of it as a guitar string. So if you go higher up on the fret, on the fretboard, you're changing the length of the string, right? Which makes it higher pitched. So you're doing the same thing here. Like the closer I bring my hand to the rim, the pitch will go higher.
Writer Stanley Crouch has observed that E pluribus unum, the motto for the seal of the United States, could also refer to the drum set. Out of many, one. The consolidation of the drums is a perfect metaphor for the consolidation of our states. Ironically, with the exception of Congo Square in Louisiana, it was illegal for slaves to play drums in this country. And this was a crushing blow. Music and dance were their principal methods of communication besides speaking. And these people were brought here in a jumble from all over West Africa, Mande, Congo, Yoruba. The only thing they had in common was a basic rhythm. And that rhythm was a lifeline to their personhood. So in America, the slave communicated with anything that could create percussive sound. Bones, quills, triangles, sticks. And if nothing was allowed, they used their bodies. This was called patent juba or ham boning. We happen to have one of the world's great juba patters from Detroit, Mr. Ali Jackson.
Juba up and Juba down, Juba going all around the town. Juba jump, Juba sing, Juba gon' cut that pigeon wing. Juba kick off this old shoe, Juba gonna Juba low, Juba this, Juba that, Juba gonna get that yellow cat.
Since the time of the Revolutionary War, the field drum was the lead percussion instrument in America. And it evolved. Okay, you got the field drum for me. I didn't know you was going to do that. It evolved into the snare drum. Traditional marching bands have separate sections: cymbals, tom-toms, snare drums, and bass drums. The African rhythmic concept merged with the marching band concept to create an American drum style. Now here comes people in New Orleans attaching a cymbal to a bass drum to accompany the snare drum. One drummer loses a job. But it's feeling much better. Now here comes high society ballroom gigs where dancers want the pizzazz of percussion and the bass drum is needed to give the bottom more body and punch. Drummers appear seated with snare and bass drum, cymbal, and wood blocks and other special effects. There's 2 more drummers out of work, and drumming is becoming a difficult job. Band leaders notice that the drummer has 1 foot free. So 2 small cymbals called a lowboy are assembled on a foot stand. A standing cymbal is added to provide higher register balance to the low-pitched bass drum, and there goes another job. Then Joe Jones of the Count Basie organization raises the lowboy to elbow height, and the sock cymbal was born. Now you have something to do with all 4 limbs, and drummers all over the world are going crazy. The drum set was the first bona fide American musical instrument. Ali Jackson. It was a practical and ingenious assembly. The drummer fulfilled a role that would have taken 3 or 4 people in African music and an entire section of a marching band. And when the drum set became the rhythmic center of passion in American music, an African identity was inextricably woven into the fabric of American culture.
Through rudiments, polyrhythms, you can take all of those levels and you could reorchestrate anything that we've done so far. If you remember our paradiddle from earlier, I'm going to play it on the snare drum, I'm going to take my right hand, and I'm going to continue with that concept, moving my right hand around to different parts of the drum kit. First tom, second tom, this other drum that I have here, which is a snare drum, my floor tom, and of course, we can't forget the rest of the kit, crash cymbals. I have another one that's a similar crash cymbal, has a bunch of holes in it, so if I play it very lightly, I get a really nice sizzle. This is called a splash. This is a trash former on top, and I have another splash underneath it as well. Here's another stack over here, the cymbal sandwich. 3 cymbals here. One on top is a 16-inch cymbal. The one all the way on the bottom is a 14-inch china. And in the middle is a really interesting looking cymbal that has a lot of little holes in it. Has a really nice, trashy, rattly sound, like this. And you can't forget the ride cymbal. Now, let's put this drum kit to good use. Paradiddle, reorchestrating, right hand moving around to the different kit pieces. And now, gotta have some music. Moving the paradiddle around, adding a little more spice. The beauty of orchestration is that it gives you a ton of options without needing to change too much rhythmically or with the rudiments that you're actually playing. It actually moves you right into the next level, which is drum fills. A drum fill happens somewhere on the drum kit that takes you into another section of a song or helps to elevate the energy. Sometimes it helps to bring the energy a little bit lower. Any of the things that we've discussed before, you can actually make those happen as drum fills. I'm gonna play a drum groove, and near the end of the drum groove, before I stop, I'm going to play a drum fill. Here's another example of that. And the third option, because why not? That's the power of drum fills. The first one was probably a little more complex in terms of it had more rhythms going on. The second one didn't have as many rhythms and it stayed on a couple of kit pieces. And of course, the last fill that I did was really sparse, meaning there wasn't a lot of information, a lot of drumming happening, and it gave that sense of going down a gear or we were about to get a little bit slower. Now for something a little more advanced, a 30-second note drum fill. Here's another option, a little more wild, some crashes, sprinkle some stuff around. Moving on from drum fills, we have embellishments. Some people might think embellishments belong just a little bit earlier, but I actually like to add embellishments or ornamentation after understanding drum fills. When you know how to play a drum fill, you can always push the envelope and embellish a certain part of the drum fill. It's really just that added expression to the moment to take it up another notch. I'm actually going to level up a drum pattern into a drum fill with more embellishments as I go along. There was a lot of improvised information and playing happening. I started out with a main pattern, and the type of things that I did were to break up the monotonous flow. So now I'm adding a really interesting element maybe on the hi-hat. There was some activity that happened on the bass drum. From there, I started adding some toms. At this point, you're getting more energy, more excitement. And I'm adding bits and pieces, adding cymbals, adding toms. It's getting even bigger to the point where you may not even recognize the original pattern, but now we are adding to the story. We're adding to the excitement and take you even higher and higher and higher until you get lost inside of all of it. I'm gonna try it again, but this time I'm gonna put a little more emphasis on some of the lower drums. I'm going to do what's called grounding the pattern in a different way by accenting rhythms that feel like they're connected to the stronger beats that we've been hearing, whether it's beat 1, 2, 3, or 4. Here we go. I was grounding the overall pattern by playing eighth notes on the floor toms so that you felt this really big Having lower tones at that part of the beat was a really cool embellishment and helped to ground what you were hearing. Then anything I added, whether it was toms or hi-hat, these were all rhythms that took me towards these bigger embellishments. Eventually, I changed the bass drum pattern, so now the core drum pattern felt a little bit different, but it had the same spirit. Let's pull it all together. You got grooves, polyrhythms, four-way coordination, embellishments, orchestration. So many of these things are going to come together in a drum solo. What you're about to hear is the last and final vamp section of Change Your Mind going into the drum solo. That's definitely one way to level up your heart rate. My goodness. Pro tip, make sure you're breathing when you're playing the drums. One thing I've come to appreciate about the levels of complexity of the drums is that once I understood from drumming how to find my voice, I realized that I didn't have to always be complex. I didn't have to always play really fast, because the purpose for me is to drive home a story or drive home a feeling. The art is in the way that you can hang left, right, or go straight through all of these levels of complexity. I hope you learned something, and if you didn't, you better hit rewind and make sure you go out and learn how to express yourself. It's levels to this thing.
want to segue into this because it has been said that it is only a certain instrument that we see in the breaks. But when you listen to what we know as the b-boy anthems, you hear certain instruments. You definitely hear drum. You hear congas. You hear bongo. You hear timbale. You hear cowbells. And I understand when it gets to
That's the rhythmic sounds of cowbells and whistles that help compose the sweet sound of Junkanoo. Now, word on the street is that the Genesis Warhawks has one of the best ballad sections in Junkanoo, and that was all the motivation I needed for this week's adventure. Deval Dean, the director of the ballad section, breaks down what sets their ballads apart from other groups.
We emphasize section practice. So we get the guys together and we just go with the bells. We work with you. We are a mixed group of seasoned and new members. So with the seasoned guys helping out the new members, we get the bells turning and we go for that train. Hence, they call us the train.
Dean says that nearly 30 members makes up the ballad train. Genesis first rushed their way on to Bay nearly a decade ago, and during that time, they have captured the best music. Dean candidly says that the bells are the glue to the music.
The drummers, they're good, they're powerful, but you need the bells to make the cohesion work between the brass and the drummers. And just the overall music, you need the bells, the tempo, the timing, the pulse, the everything is the bells, the heart. You understand? You need the bells.
The cowbells is a unique instrument. There's the treble and the bucket bell.
So not everyone can make them. There are a few guys who make them. It's a very special skill and they're kind of limited. You know, you can't go to a store and buy them. So you have to put in special orders and we have to work with the guy who makes them and put in our order and get our bells custom made.
As Genesis prepare for another morning on Bay, Dean shares what he
The role of jug bands in music history. Jug bands got their name from using instruments that were either homemade or household items such as a jug. They originated in the South in the 19th century in Louisville, Kentucky, were made up predominantly of African American musicians and were in their heyday from the 1890s to the Great Depression.
Bottles. There was a continuum of music in river towns along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. So what was happening in New Orleans was also going on in Louisville, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Pittsburgh. In the 1890s, spasm bands began to appear in New Orleans' Storyville red light district. These were kids' bands that played on homemade instruments. Because of Louisville's thriving bourbon industry, the spasm groups in the River City gravitated to the jug, which was known as the poor man's tuba. Bar owners immediately recognized the promotional value of these groups. Many of Louisville's businesses would sponsor their own jug bands to play at store openings or events. The first jug bands to record were Sir Martin's Jug Band and Whistler's Jug Band. Martin grew up in Louisville's Smoketown neighborhood. Her musical career took off when she recorded Sugar Blues with New Orleans pianist Clarence Williams. Martin was a classic blues singer. These were well-dressed female singers who were backed by jazz groups. She was already a star on the vaudeville circuit when she began recording for OK Records in 1922. Martin also became a talent scout for OK Records. The first artist she brought to the label was guitarist Sylvester Weaver, who also grew up in the Smoketown neighborhood. In 1923, he and Martin recorded Longing for Daddy Blues and I've Got to Go and Leave My Daddy Behind for OK. These recordings were the first time that a singer was backed by only a guitar. The following year, other blues women would also record with just a guitar accompaniment. Weaver's solo guitar recording career began in November 1923 with Guitar Blues and Guitar Rag. This blues milestone was the first time a solo guitar instrumental was ever recorded, and this slide guitar instrumental became a Western swing hit for Bob Wills in 1936. He recorded it as Steel Guitar Rag. During Weaver's
A cowbell is a form of clapper bell that is customarily attached to a leather strap and suspended from the neck of herd animals such as cows or sheep. Cowbells are used both on animals in hilly or alpine areas to indicate their location, and on led animals to bring in herds for milking or to a sheepfold. Some cowbells, such as the Hungarian Shango, take a conventional bell form, which is distinguishable from the quadrilateral shape of the Coulomb type. This latter type is made of sheet iron or copper, and is welded or has a soldered seam. The larger the piece of sheet metal used, the more mellow and resonant is the sound of the instrument. In some alpine regions that rely on pastoral economies and have large herds, tuned sets of cowbells mounted on a stand or a portable T-frame are used as musical instruments. Although from mouth to suspension ring they are generally wider than they are high, longer types were used in Slovenia and other regions. These are closer to the African clapperless bell, frequently termed a gong, which is struck with a light hammer. Double gongs, either connected by a single arched handle or mounted one above the other, are common in West and Central Africa. This may account for the clapperless bell being used as a rhythm instrument in African American folk bands, where the cowbell is usually attached to a washboard or incorporated in the traps of a drum kit.
Welcome to this series of videos covering the components of the early drum set. The cowbell comes to drummers from the world of farming, where clappers inside of cowbells strung around the necks of livestock would let the farmers know where their sheep and cows and goats were. And the cowbell isn't the only instrument that comes to us from a non-musical source. Other examples include bones and spoons, washboards, and what we now know as brushes. Our drumming peers from 100 years ago used cowbells on their drum sets when they were working in vaudeville theaters, in the silent film theaters, traveling shows, dance bands, and performing live music in roller skating rinks. Cowbells were often used along with woodblock, Chinese cymbal, and choke cymbal. There were two general styles of cowbell holders. Some cowbells were secured on a post, while others had a slot system that kept the cowbells in place. In addition to single cowbell mounting systems, there were double cowbell mounting systems, and those drummers would use two different pitches of cowbells, one high and one low. And if you were really fancy, you had 4 cowbells, tuned. Some drummers had 4 separate cowbells, and others had nested cowbells like the one you see here. And like the Chinese cymbal, the cowbell was a part of the standard issue for an army drummer in the early 1900s. In our next segment, we'll talk about
hand, stomp your feet. That part right there, when the break, boom, I had to come in with bongo rock.
The first incarnation of the incredible bongo band was Ed Green, Wilton Felder, Joe Sample, David T. Walker, Bobby Hall, and Dean Parks, all American.